Good evening. This is Ken Long from Tortoise Capital, and we're going to conduct a little exercise in critical thinking, decision making, and reflective learning. What I'd like for you to do is to start with a 4-column learning journal that has the following features. Column 1 is for recording aha moments. Column 2 for recording your reflective thinking about those aha moments. Column 3, recording your commitment to action as a result of taking that reflective thinking. And column 4, developing a plan for how you will assess the results of the actions that you will have taken. So that represents the Kolb experiential learning model in a nutshell, with some refinements that are committed towards improved action. But the aha moment is something that grabs our attention, engages us in a direct, visceral way. It's something that we are surprised by. We're engaged at the emotional level. And so in this column, record a rich description of that direct experience. Be as detailed as possible. Engage all your senses and feelings. Think hard about what those sensory experiences were. Probe. Once you're done recording that, when that feels like you've done what you can do, in the reflective thinking, we want you to think about the experience, what it could mean, what it might mean. Adopt different perspectives, critical thinking, creative thinking, and then conclude with a narrative that allows you to tie it all together and make sense of it in a nice package. That's your reflective thinking. Because we want a commitment to action, in this third column, we want you to commit to what you're going to do about the insights that came out of that reflective thinking, the so what of it. How will you put it into action? With what priority? What are the outcomes that you want? What are the risks and rewards? What are the consequences of doing nothing with your insight? And once you've committed to that action in column 3, think about, in column 4, how you're going to assess the results. This is your hypothesis. This is your scientific mind. This is your chance to think rationally about what the different experimental results could be and what they might mean and how you're going to interpret them before you get to the experiment. Recording the preconditions so that when the results there, they don't skew you into thinking about the results in a biased way. So I want you to have this 4-column journal available to you as you go through these exercises, and you should be looking first for the aha moments and maybe jot some quick notes for the reflective thinking. At the end of this, I'll ask you to fill those out further and then commit to action and examine or develop a plan for what to do with the results. So as we go through on the first pass, it's the aha moments and maybe a few notes about reflective thinking that should predominate. Okay, so let's proceed on. First, I want you to consider an X and Y axis with the X-axis representing increasing complexity of your decision-making process. So I want you to think about a circumstance in which you make decisions and then consider increasing complexity as you go to the right. On the Y-axis, I want you to think about the effectiveness of your decision-making process as a function of the relative amount of complexity. So as complexity increases, what happens to the effectiveness of your decision-making process? So think about that for a minute, and then draw a curve that you think represents that situation or that process or that environment in which you are habitually making decisions. What's the relationship now between complexity and the effectiveness of that decision-making process for you? Draw that curve. Stop the tape here. Okay, moving on. Now, your curve may look like some of these. The green curve is something where there's a direct linear relationship between effectiveness and complexity, such that the simpler, the better, and that there is a direct trailing off of effectiveness as complexity enters the realm. The red line is the opposite of that, that too simple is not good enough, and as we add more variables and more considerations, the effectiveness of the decisions increase. The black line represents something where there doesn't seem to be any relationship. It's a constant level of effectiveness regardless of how complex or how simple you're making it. So we haven't figured out what the causal relationship or the correlation is. There's nothing. The blue line represents something where too simple is not so good, and as you add some complexity to it, you get dramatically better. But at some point, there's a point of diminishing returns in which now effectiveness is decreasing as we add more and more complexity. So we could think of the blue line as representing something like a sweet spot. So take a few moments and think about this, study those lines, compare your lines to it, and think about which curve is yours and what it might mean, and any ideas that may have occurred to you as a consequence of that short discussion. Use your learning journal. Moving on. Now I want you to look at the curve that you drew, and I want you to think about the mental models and the assumptions that you made about that decision-making process and the environment. In order to allow yourself to draw the curve, you had to make some decisions. You had to think about what complexity means to you. You'd think about a decision-making process and what that means, and then what effectiveness means to you, and how you define them and how you measure them and by what scale. Think about the experience of yours that curve describes, and what was the evidence that you used to justify drawing the curve in which you drew. Why did it come out that way? What were some of the underlying mental models and constructs that allowed you to complete that task, which was written with deliberate vagueness? What do we mean exactly by complexity? What do we mean exactly by effectiveness? And what do we mean by decision-making process? Was it an individual one? Was it in a context of family or friends or professional or career? Was it current or was it in the past? What caused you to go to that particular environment or that particular process as representative of you? Were there other ones you could have chosen? Are other environments featuring the same style of decision-making? Is there a common thread between different environments that are constant about how you make decisions? Or does your decision-making process change as a function of the environment and the time frame and the purpose and the seriousness and the consequences? So start thinking about some of those things and spend some time with your learning journal. Moving on. Now, having thought your way through all that for about 5 minutes, I'd like you to take a look at this list here. Which of the following metrics or qualities or mental models or concepts came into your head? Was there any notion of speed? Is that a quality that informs effectiveness? How about the cost of the decision-making process compared to the value add? Was there any notion of how many you got right, like a win rate? Where was the value add of taking more time? As you increased complexity, was value add a consideration, or is that where the point of diminishing returns occurred? If a decision-making process is adaptable and can be applied to many different situations, we might be able to accept less than the highest quality of individual decisions, provided we have some consistency. And so the ability to adapt to changing environment has a quality and an effectiveness all by itself, all of its own, regardless of the individual particular outcome. Was there some notion about how frequent you had to make decisions? When you make decisions in that process, Do they last for a while? Decide and then you're done? Or was it a feature where you were getting repetitive and cycles and iterations of decision making? Any thoughts about the stress created by the act of decision making? If a decision making process allows you to reduce stress, is that a measure of effectiveness because of the reduced cost on your body and mind and spirit? How about robustness? How many different environments does that decision-making process seem to cover, or is it specialized? If you have too many specialized decision-making processes, what does that do for the overall cost and quality and effectiveness of the meta system? How reliable is it? Does it break down? Does it need a lot of tinkering, or is it good to go once you master it? Frequency, how often? Results distribution. Did you think about an average, or was it a range of results that have a histogram-like quality with an average and a max and a min, and the standard deviation? How important is the distribution of results, and how does that contribute to your satisfaction as a measure of effectiveness? Is satisfaction a measure of effectiveness? Is it a feeling, or is it a dollar value or a point value that can be computed by an external tabulator? Is the system under control? Is there a reliability and a predictability to the decisions and the results? If it's under control, does that allow you now to start changing some variables and parameters to explore? If it's not under control, what do you have to do to get it under control before you can start looking for cause and effect and adjusting variables? Is it an explicit decision-making process? Does it have rules? Can those rules be followed? Can they be judged? Can you be evaluated on your ability to follow the checklist? Is it transparent? Is it revealed? Or is it something that relies on intuition and the inner life of the mind? Which of these metrics and qualities did you consider? If there were ones on that list that you didn't think about, what do you think about now? Would you change the way you draw the curve? Would you pick a different process? Does it allow you to see things in a new light and from a different perspective? Take notes in your learning journal about those ideas. Take 5 or 10 minutes. Moving on. As you think now about the question as posed and the curve you drew and the curves you compared it to, and you're thinking about important terms and the amount of evidence it took to qualify that experience and different aspects of metrics and performance considerations, take a look back at your learning journal. What automatic thought processes and assumptions did this exercise reveal about your normal, habitual way of thinking? Where are some areas that you might be able to explore more deliberately your process for making decisions? Is there something that suggests itself as an important area? Is there some feeling that you have about something that needs more attention based on anything we've said or discussed so far? Note that in your commitment to action column or in your reflective thinking column. Moving on. Now I want you to think about the red curve from A to B to C in red. If this is your curve and you find yourself at point C in the current operation of that process, you're probably not satisfied because it feels too complex, and when you were simpler, things were better. But I want you to think about, how do you know that your curve is actually the red curve and not just a form of the blue curve? Because it could be the blue curve and all you've considered is from B to C, and that you haven't progressed to the point of extreme simplicity yet. And from point B, the extreme simplicity might yield you dramatic improvements, but it might start to suboptimize. So if you thought you were at C and you wanted to do something about it, like you move towards B in simplicity, how would you know how far to go before you had gone far enough? How much evidence in degrading from B, if you were the blue line in effect, how far would you have to drift down to the point where you recognize B was actually the sweet spot? How could you think of that ahead of time? How could you quantify that? What kind of measures of effectiveness might you use to define what you really mean now by effectiveness of decision making and what you mean by complexity? Is it conscious complexity or unconscious? Is it the total cost, the number of processes? If you can automate a complex operation and put it inside a black box or streamline it with a spreadsheet or a rule-based system, is it really that complex once more if it doesn't take a lot of mental energy for you to operate it? Which is the working definition of complexity that satisfies you? The amount of personal commitment it takes to operate it, or simply the number of decisions that have to be made as part of an automated or semi-automated process? So, how do you know that the red curve is yours, if that's your curve? How do you know that you've gone past B all the way to A and made it as simple as possible? How would you detect the difference between the red curve and the blue curve based on how you've defined an operational measure of effectiveness? Ponder that for a while with your learning journal. Moving on. So suppose now you are at point C and you've begun a deliberate program of simplifying your decision making because you intend to get towards B and then maybe up towards A. And you anticipate that moving from C to B will yield a benefit. But once you implement this new pilot program in decision making, attempts to simplify, you begin to experience worse results, not the better results that you had theoretically hoped to see. So what you really find yourself is, instead of at the blue B, you find yourself at the red B. So think about that kind of situation. Has that ever occurred in your life before, where you thought it could be one way and it actually turned out to be the other as a consequence of simplifying? What were the contributing factors to that? Why did it happen? Was it something you did, or was it something in the environment? Did you just underestimate the challenges of simplifying, or was it something in the environment that was the cause and it wasn't related to the change in your behavior at all? Well, if you take C as sort of the baseline from where you decided to try to improve towards B, but now you find yourself at the red B, ask yourself, which is the error factor that you care the most about? Which is the one that tells you you have a problem? When you have degraded from the previous state of the art, or the baseline, a certain distance, so in other words, the pinkish error factor, or are you distressed because you thought you were going to get to the blue B, but in fact you've drifted that much further? Which is the one that causes you the most concern? Which is the one that drives your decision about when to stop the experiment and then reset and then revise? We've moved just a distance that might be considered normal, how far does it have to go before it becomes abnormal? Did you set that threshold before you started the experiment? Did you think about what kind of evidence it would take for you to believe that that experiment in going from red C to blue B wasn't going to be effective? Was it a fall back towards the baseline, or did you have to fall as far as the red B? Which was the operational measure? Or can you care about both? The most important thing was, has the distance to the red B, is it far enough to stop the program of plan change? Did you know what the threshold was before you began the program of change? That's the equivalent of having a stop loss in your trade before you enter, knowing the price that disproves the hypothesis, knowing how much evidence it takes for you to rule out any further operation. You have to know that before you make the entry in your trade. And so if you're going to engage in something as cognitively challenging and important as simplifying your decision-making rules, you better know how much it's going to take to cause you to stop the experiment. How do you set that threshold? Is it based on the estimate of what the results should be if everything works in your favor for B? Or is this a psychological reward to risk concern? Is it a matter of time? What's the measurement? What's the scale? How are you going to build accountability? How will you be disciplined in ensuring that you stop at the red B if you've defined that as a threshold? How are you going to honor that stop? Where's the accountability? Where's the fail-safe that tells you it's time to stop and that you will. Because you did that with your rational mind, but when you're in here losing ground on your previous style, you may be encountering some emotional concerns. How will you know that? So the most important question out of all this, do you know the threshold to stop before you begin your program of change? And if so, how did you know it? How did you set it? Why does that work for you? Why is it appropriate? And if you don't know what that threshold is, why on earth would you engage in a program of change without knowing what it would take to define failure ahead of time? If not, why not? What would it take to add that idea, that concept to your repertoire? How do you figure out how far is enough? How are you going to measure that risk? Is there more than one measure? Could you have multiple stops? This is no different than trading, because we're concerned with a reward to risk. Do you have a 2-to-1 reward to risk ratio with a reason to believe that you can actually achieve the blue B and realize and manifest the 2R win in improvement compared to the 1R that you're willing to lose? And if you don't have a 2-to-1, what can you do to improve the odds? What can you do to improve the payoff? Is there some way to pile on and synthesize and get more? How do we frame this decision to engage in a program of change in decision making in the same way that we frame reward to risk ratios? Think about that for a while. Now what I'd like you to do is go back over your notes and your reflections on your learning journal, and then consider the slides and go back through and be rigorous and as detailed as you can be on the second and third pass about recording the rich descriptions, the sights, sounds, smells, feelings, and intuitions about any aha moments you may have had during this discussion. Then think about them with your rational mind. Adopt a different stance. Talk to your partners. Talk to your trading mentors or your trading partners or your table discussants. Compare notes. How many different ways can you think about the rich experience that you've recorded? How many different angles can you take? Once you put that together and tied it up and converged back towards some individual sense making, what does it make you want to do? What kind of things might you do? What's your plan for action? What's your priorities? What are the intended outcomes? Think about the results. And in the last discussion we had about how far is far enough? How will you know when the experiment is over? How will you document those changes? How will you take the positive things that come out of that and incorporate it into your routines? How can you simplify? How can you standardize? How can you put that into processes that free up the cognitive energy to continue to inquire and explore and push the boundaries? We want to develop new behaviors and turn them into instincts and lower the transaction costs for getting them done, and then make it easier to implement so we can turn our attention to new boundaries and keep advancing the ball. So think about that in your 4 columns now, and I'll be very interested to see what you think about this experiment. So thanks for your kind attention. Thanks for playing along. It's the 1-minute decision maker and the reflective learner. So thank you very much.